Bonjour, my darlings. I am the author of Nightmares, seeking the ears of the brave. Sit by candlelight and listen as I, Madame Nova, weaves a tale of mystery and darkness. But beware, the ending remains untold. Dare to venture into the crypt of comments below to leave your mark and shape the final twist of this dark tale. The Silent Driver. It was late. Too late for me to be out, but my train had been delayed and I missed the last bus. The only option was to call a ride. I stood on the corner, the street lights buzzing faintly above me. The app said my driver was only 2 minutes away. A black sedan, driver's name Arthur. When the car pulled up, it was exactly as described, though the windows were tinted darker than usual. The interior smelled faintly of old leather as I climbed into the back seat. "Hi, Arthur," I asked. The driver nodded but didn't say a word. He didn't even glance at me, just kept his hands on the wheel and his face forward. "All right, cool," I muttered, settling into my seat. The car eased into the street, the city lights blurring past. At first, I didn't think much of his silence. Some drivers weren't chatty, and that was fine with me. I wasn't in the mood to talk either, but something about him felt off. His posture was too rigid, his movements almost mechanical. His hands, gripping the wheel, looked pale, almost grey in the dim light. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but when I glanced at the app, I realised the car wasn't heading toward my destination. "Hey, I think you missed a turn back there," I said. No response. My heart rate picked up. "Arthur? Did you hear me?" He didn't even flinch. "Seriously, man, I need you to turn around. This isn't the right way." Still nothing. I started to panic. The streets were getting quieter, the buildings fewer and farther apart. We were leaving the city. "Let me out," I said, my voice rising. "Pull over and let me out right now." Arthur didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. The locks were engaged and the buttons on the door wouldn't work. "Hey!" I shouted, banging on the window. "Stop the car!" That's when he spoke, his voice low and chilling. "You shouldn't have gotten in." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned onto a narrow, unlit road. The trees on either side formed a canopy, swallowing the car in darkness. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the partition. Arthur finally turned to face me, or rather his reflection did. His eyes in the rearview mirror weren't human. They were black, endless voids, pulling me in like a whirlpool. His lips twisted into a grin that sent ice down my spine. "You're already where you're meant to be," he said. The car came to a sudden stop, throwing me forward. When I looked up, I was alone. The driver's seat was empty. The doors were unlocked. I scrambled out of the car, my chest heaving with panic. The sedan sat in the middle of the dark road, its headlights flickering, but when I turned to look back, it was gone. I stood there, shaking, until I found the courage to pull out my phone. The app showed my ride had been cancelled. No record of Arthur, no record of the trip. The next day, I checked the news. An article popped up immediately. Rideshare, driver found dead in abandoned car. Black sedan, name, Arthur. The date of the accident? 3 years ago to the day. The all-knowing passenger. It started like any other shift. I was sitting in the cab, rain hammering the windshield, checking my phone for ride requests. 6 months since I left Chicago, 6 months of trying to stay invisible. Driving here felt safe. The notification pinged. Passenger, unknown. Something about it made me pause, but I couldn't afford to be picky. I accepted. When I pulled up to the curb, the guy climbed in without a word. Hood up, face buried in shadows. The air in the car shifted as soon as he closed the door. It felt heavy. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't answer right away, just stared back at me, the edges of a smile curling at his lips. You've been driving 2 years, made 4,763 trips. Oh, and that speeding ticket? 5 over the limit last week. Close call, huh? My stomach dropped. My hands tightened on the wheel. How the hell did he know that? Do I know you? I stammered, trying to sound calm. He chuckled, low and quiet, leaning forward enough for his breath to fog the mirror. Oh, I know you, Sean. I know why you left Chicago. I know what's in your trunk. Every nerve in my body lit up at once. My foot hovered over the brake, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't told anyone, not a soul. How could you possibly... Drive, he said, cutting me off. And I did. I don't know why I didn't just stop the car right there. Call the cops. Something about him, his voice, his presence, froze me in place. My brain screamed at me to think, to figure out who he was, how he knew so much. He didn't say a word as we drove, just sat there, watching me in the mirror like a predator studying prey. I couldn't take it anymore. Listen, I said, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Does it look like I'm joking? I glanced back at him, and for the first time, a street light caught his face. Sharp cheekbones, hollow eyes, a twisted little grin. No one I recognized, but something about him felt familiar. You thought leaving Chicago would erase what you did, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. Starting over here, playing the good guy, but you can't outrun it. You can't outrun her. My breath hitched. I didn't have a choice, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine in the mirror. An accident doesn't leave someone locked in a trunk, Sean. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My grip on the wheel faltered. A faint metallic stench filled the car, and I knew he smelled it too. You don't know what you're talking about, I said, but even I didn't believe it. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, he said, smiling. Let's just say I have my sources. We reached the edge of town, the road narrowing into a dark stretch flanked by trees. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but the air felt heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. Pull over, he said. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes told me I didn't have a choice. I eased the car onto the shoulder, the engine rumbling softly in the silence. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just stepped out of the car and motioned for me to follow. The cold rain soaked through my jacket as I climbed out. My legs felt like lead as I followed him to the back of the cab. He stood by the trunk, his hand resting on the lid like he owned it. Open it, he said. My hands shook as I fumbled for the key. I didn't want to do it, but it was like my body moved on its own. The trunk popped open and the stench hit me full force. There it was, the tarp, blood-soaked and heavy with the weight of what I'd done. I didn't mean to, I said, the words spilling out of me. She was going to ruin me. I panicked. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. She was going to leave you, he said softly. That's not a crime, Sean. But what you did. I stumbled back, slipping on the wet pavement. Please, I begged, you don't have to do this. But he didn't stop. The last thing I saw was the blade glinting in the rain. When I came to, I wasn't standing anymore. I was lying on the ground, staring up at the night sky. The rain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him walking away, disappearing into the woods without a word. The cab sat there, taillights glowing like red eyes in the dark. The trunk was still open, the tarp inside catching the rain. And then, just as the world started to fade, I heard the radio crackle to life. "Sean, are you there? You've got a new ride request." The last fare. It was supposed to be a slow night. Rain drizzled steadily and the city streets were nearly deserted. I'd been driving for hours without much action when the notification came through on my phone. Pickup location, Crestwood Cemetery. I stared at it for a moment. It wasn't unusual for fares to come from odd places, but a cemetery at 11:47 p.m? Still, a job's a job. I arrived a few minutes later, pulling up near the main gate. The cemetery loomed, its wrought iron fence and towering oaks casting eerie shadows in my headlights. A figure emerged from the darkness, walking slowly toward the car. The passenger was a woman, pale and soaked from the rain. She wore a long black coat and held a small bouquet of wilted flowers. She didn't look at me as she slid into the back seat, just muttered an address. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared out the window, her fingers tightening around the flowers. I started driving, the sound of the rain filling the silence between us. The destination wasn't far, an old residential neighborhood on the edge of town. As we drove, I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes seemed distant. "You all right back there?" I asked. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "He used to drive me home, you know, every night after work. I'd sit in the back, just like this. He always played the same song on the radio." "That's so?" I replied, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. She didn't respond. About halfway through the drive, my phone chimed. I glanced at it quickly, another fare request, but when I looked back at the road, I slammed the brakes. A man was standing in the middle of the street, completely still. "Jesus!" I shouted, my heart pounding. The woman in the back didn't react. I waited for the man to move, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring at me. Finally, I swerved around him, cursing under my breath. "You didn't see that guy?" I asked, looking at her in the mirror. She shook her head slowly. "No one's out here." I glanced back, but the man was gone. When we finally reached her destination, I stopped in front of a small, run-down house. The windows were boarded up and the yard was overgrown. It looked abandoned. "Here we are," I said, but she didn't move. "I never made it home that night," she said, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" She turned to look at me then, and my blood ran cold. Her face was no longer pale. It was grey, her skin sunken and her eyes hollow. "I never made it home," she repeated, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small space of the car. I scrambled to unlock the doors, but they wouldn't budge. My breath came in shallow gasps as I twisted the handle, but it was like the car was frozen. When I looked back, the back seat was empty. I sat there for what felt like hours, rain pounding on the roof. When I finally gathered the courage to step out, I checked the back seat, the ground, the entire area. Nothing, no trace of her at all. When I got back into the car, I glanced at the bouquet of flowers she'd left behind. They were fresh, vibrant roses. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the address she'd given me and found an article from years ago. A local woman killed in hit and run, returning home from Crestwood Cemetery. Her picture was there, smiling and alive, and I swear it was her.